The U.S. government is demanding that Cambodia pay back a 50-year-old loan of $500 million given to Cambodia's then illegitimate government by the Nixon administration in the early 1970s. Many historians consider their government to be a U.S. puppet regime installed by Nixon during the U.S. war in neighboring Vietnam. To discuss this debt repayment demand by the U.S., we're now joined by author Robert Freeman, author of Vietnam, The Best 1 Hour History. Now, Robert, thank you so much for joining us. It's been about 40 years since the U.S. dropped 500,000 tons of explosives over Cambodia's countryside, killing millions of people. Now, many Americans are not aware of this or aware of the subsequent rise of the Khmer Rouge, which you compare to ISIS. But first, what is your response to this debt repayment demand?
Well, there's no question historically that the U.S. inflicted massive damage on Cambodian society. As you mentioned, they dropped, 500,000 tons of bombs on Cambodia, killed something like 2 million people in the aftermath. It's a little bit like me hitting you over the head with a hammer, and in the process, the handle on the hammer breaks, and so I sue you for having broken the handle on my hammer.
So obviously it doesn't make much sense here. Now, the Khmer Rouge was responsible for the deaths of nearly 2 million people, as you mentioned, who died in forced labor camps known as the Killing Fields. Now, do you think the U.S. bears some responsibility for the rise of the Khmer Rouge?
The Khmer Rouge would probably never have existed in the state that it was had it not been for the U.S. Let me explain the situation. Nixon came into power in 1969. He had promised a secret plan to end the war in Vietnam. Immediately, he began illegal bombings of Cambodia, which was adjacent to Vietnam. The North Vietnamese were using Cambodia as sanctuaries to launch attacks on South Vietnam. Nixon carried out these illegal bombings until they were discovered in 1973. The bombings dropped more than 500,000 tons of bombs on Cambodia, utterly destroying the civil infrastructure of the society. Now, before the U.S. had started the bombing, the Khmer Rouge were a very minor communist sect in Cambodia. But they used the U.S. bombings to justify the recruitment of more and more members. By 1973, when the U.S. left Vietnam, the Khmer Rouge had more than 100,000 members. In 1975, they overthrew the U.S. puppet regime of Lon Nol and began carrying out what you described as the killing fields. They went around and rounded up anybody with any kind of Western influence, intellectuals, teachers, doctors, engineers, shipped them out of the cities into the countryside into what were called the killing fields, and they systematically exterminated them. The best data from UN commissions and reports is that they killed something like 2 million people. Is the largest proportional genocide in modern history. The U.S. is undoubtedly directly implicated.
Wow. Now, in your recent essay, ISIS is Arabic for Khmer Rouge, you argue that the Khmer Rouge is a historical parallel to the rise of ISIS in the Middle East, while U.S. interventions serve as recruiting for such groups. Now, can you please explain how that happens?
Well, I've alluded to it a little bit, but let me extend the comparison to ISIS just a little bit more. In Cambodia, the U.S. destroyed the structure of civil society. Into that vacuum swooped the nihilistic, fundamentalist, anti-Western ideology of the Khmer Rouge. The exact same thing happened with the U.S. illegal invasion and destruction of Iraqi society. Into that vacuum swept the nihilistic, fundamentalist, anti-Western ideology of Al-Qaeda. Now, in the case of Iraq, Al-Qaeda, and ISIS, what happened was the U.S. then went to those Al-Qaeda elements and said, we need a cat's paw. We need a set of proxies who can do our dirty work for us in this area, because the U.S. people are losing patience with American boys coming home in body bags. So we'd rather use you guys to do our dirty work. That's when the recruitment, the provisioning, the training, the funding of ISIS began in 2011. The U.S. recruited and was joined readily by its allies in the Persian Gulf, the Emirates, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, to provide funding. The U.S. provided coordination and intelligence and essentially decided to use ISIS to carry out its policy of regime change against the Assad government in Syria. That policy is still underway today.
All right, Robert, we have about 50 seconds left. Do you see any historic parallels between current U.S. military reliance on airstrikes in Iraq and previous bombing strategy in Vietnam and Cambodia?
There are some very interesting parallels. Let's recall, the U.S. did not win in Vietnam. It did not win in Iraq. And it's an explicit part of U.S. policy that if we can't win, then we'll at least leave behind as much devastation as we possibly can. In the case of Vietnam, we had dropped 21 million gallons of Agent Orange on the country, leaving it the greatest man-made environmental catastrophe in the history of the world. In the case of Iraq, we left many millions of tons of depleted uranium, which was the ordnance we used to destroy Iraqi society, leaving Iraq the most radioactive geography in the history of the world. The parallels are almost perfect.
All right, Robert, thank you so much for shining light on this important issue. That was author Robert Freeman. Thank you
You're very
so
welcome.
much.